The history of the Victoria Cross. The Victoria Cross stands as the highest and most revered award for gallantry in the face of the enemy. Within the British and Commonwealth honours system, its significance lies not only in its prestige, but in the standard it represents. A cross nearly to centuries of conflict-spanning imperial wars, global wars, and modern engagements. Countless acts of bravery have been performed in service of Britain and its successor nations. Yet only a small number have been judged to meet the threshold required for the Victoria Cross. This rarity is not incidental. It is fundamental to the decoration's meaning. The origins of the Victoria Cross are closely tied to the Crimean War 1853-1856, a conflict that exposed both the strengths and the deficiencies of the British military system. Prior to this period, recognition for bravery was largely confined to officers and the aristocracy. Ordinary soldiers were rarely celebrated. Decorations such as the Order of the Bath existed, but they were not designed to recognize acts of individual gallantry by ordinary soldiers. The Crimean War, however, unfolded under unprecedented public scrutiny. War correspondents, most notably William Howard Russell of the Times, reported directly from the front lines, bringing accounts of both heroism and mismanagement to a wide audience. These reports revealed a disparity between the actions of soldiers and the recognition they received. Enlisted men performed acts of extraordinary courage. They rescued comrades under fire and held positions against overwhelming odds, yet had no formal means of recognition equivalent to officers. Public awareness of this imbalance generated pressure for reform. It was within this context that Queen Victoria authorized a new decoration. It was within this context that Queen Victoria authorized the creation of a new decoration. Instituted by royal warrant on the 29th of January 1856, the Victoria Cross was designed to recognize most conspicuous bravery, or some daring or preeminent act of valor or self-sacrifice, or extreme devotion to duty in the presence of the enemy. This wording, which remains central to the award, established a standard that was both precise and deliberately high. One of the defining features of the Victoria Cross was its egalitarian intent. Unlike earlier honors, it was explicitly open to all ranks. Officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted men were equally eligible. This represented a significant shift in military culture, acknowledging that courage was not confined to social class or rank. The decoration itself reflected this principle. It was intentionally simple in design, lacking the elaborate ornamentation associated with other awards. The emphasis was placed on the act, not the status of the recipient. A persistent and widely repeated tradition holds that all Victoria Cross medals are made from the metal of a single Russian. Cannon captured during the Crimean War, specifically from the siege of Sevastopol. The metal used in the early production of the Victoria Cross did originate from captured ordnance, believed to be from Chinese cannons held by Russian forces rather than Russian guns themselves. Cray and Ashton. The Vestige 1985. The ingots used to produce the medals have been carefully preserved, and subsequent awards continue to be cast from this original source. Regardless of the precise origin of the metal, the symbolism is clear. The use of captured cannon represents the transformation of instruments of war into symbols of individual courage. It reinforces the connection between the award and the battlefield, grounding it in the material reality of conflict. The process of awarding the Victoria Cross has always been rigorous. Recommendations typically originate from commanding officers and must be supported by witness statements. The requirement for corroboration is strict, reflecting the need to ensure that the act meets the established criteria. In many cases, particularly in modern conflicts, this has become increasingly complex due to the nature of warfare. Nonetheless, the principle remains: the award is not given lightly. The rarity of the Victoria Cross is often cited as evidence of its significance, but this rarity must be understood in context. Britain and its Commonwealth forces have been engaged in warfare for centuries, from the Napoleonic Wars through to contemporary conflicts. In each of these engagements, acts of bravery have been common. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen have repeatedly demonstrated courage under fire. Yet only a fraction of these acts have been recognized with the Victoria Cross. This disparity reflects the distinction between bravery and most conspicuous bravery. The latter implies not only courage, but a level of action that stands out even among those who are themselves acting bravely. It is a comparative standard measured against the already high baseline of conduct expected in combat. As one historian has noted, the Victoria Cross is not awarded for bravery alone, but for bravery of such a degree that it compels recognition above all others present. This distinction is critical. It explains why, despite the scale and frequency of conflict, the number of Victoria Cross recipients remains limited. First-hand accounts from recipients and witnesses provide insight into the nature of such actions. They often involve moments in which individuals act decisively under extreme conditions, frequently at significant personal risk. These actions are not always planned. They occur in response to immediate circumstances, where hesitation could result in loss of life or failure of the mission. One early recipient, describing his actions during the Crimean War, stated simply that there was no time to consider the danger. It was necessary to act. This absence of deliberation is a recurring theme. The actions that lead to the Victoria Cross are often instinctive, driven by training, duty, and a sense of responsibility toward others. The creation of the Victoria Cross also had a broader cultural impact. It established a visible standard of heroism, one that could be recognized and communicated across society. Recipients became figures of public interest, their actions reported in newspapers and commemorated in various forms. This visibility reinforced the values associated with the award, shaping public perceptions of military service and sacrifice. Over time, the Victoria Cross was adopted by other nations within the British Empire and later the Commonwealth. Countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and Canada established their own versions of the award, maintaining the same criteria and design while reflecting national identity. Despite these developments, the fundamental meaning of the Victoria Cross has remained consistent. It is an award defined not by frequency, but by exception. It represents the highest standard of individual gallantry, recognized across generations and conflicts. Its origins in the Crimean War provided the foundation, but its significance has been shaped by the actions of those who have received it. The Victoria Cross was created in response to the realities of the Crimean War, but its meaning was not fully defined until it was awarded. The wording of the Royal Warrant Most Conspicuous Bravery provided a standard. Yet, it was through the actions of the first recipients that this standard was established. The Crimean War itself was marked by both organizational failure and individual initiative. British forces operated under conditions that were often chaotic, with inadequate supply systems, poor communication, and unclear command structures. Within this environment, acts of bravery frequently occurred not as part of coordinated plans, but as responses to immediate crises. It was precisely these moments where individuals acted decisively. Despite confusion and danger that the Victoria Cross was intended to recognize. The first awards of the Victoria Cross were formally presented on the 26th of June 1857 in Hyde Park by Queen Victoria herself. The ceremony was significant not only as a public recognition of individual gallantry, but as a symbolic affirmation of the award's egalitarian intent. Men of different ranks stood together, receiving the same decoration for actions judged equally exceptional, affirming the award's egalitarian intent. Among the earliest recipients was Charles Davis Lucas, whose actions during the bombardment of Burmasand in 1854 are often cited as the first instance of conduct meeting the Victoria Cross standard. During the engagement, an enemy shell landed on the deck of his ship, HMS Hecla. Recognizing the immediate danger to the crew, Lucas picked up the live shell and threw it overboard before it could explode. The act was both simple and extraordinary. It required immediate recognition of the threat and a willingness to accept personal risk in order to protect others. A contemporary account describes, a shell fell upon the deck, its fuse still burning. Without hesitation, Mr. Lucas seized it and cast it into the sea. What distinguishes this action is not only the danger involved, but the absence of deliberation. There was no time for calculation. The decision was instantaneous, driven by an understanding of the consequences of inaction. This pattern-rapid decision-making under extreme pressure would become a recurring characteristic of Victoria Cross actions. Another recipient, Luke O'Connor, demonstrated gallantry during the Battle of the Alma, carrying the regimental colours under heavy fire after others had fallen. He bore the colours forward with conspicuous bravery, setting an example that rallied those around him. The emphasis here is not solely on the act itself, but on its effect. Victoria Cross actions often influence the behaviour of others, either by preserving order, enabling movement, or preventing collapse under pressure. The individual act becomes a focal point. Victoria Cross actions often influence others by preserving order or preventing collapse under pressure. Perhaps the most frequently cited example from the Crimean War is the Charge of the Light Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava. While the charge itself has been widely analysed as a failure of command, it produced numerous instances of individual bravery. Among those recognised was William Stanlake, who returned under fire to assist wounded comrades during the chaotic withdrawal. Eyewitnesses noted the fire was continuous, the ground strewn with men and horses. yet some turned back to bring others out. This willingness to re-enter danger involves a conscious decision to prioritize others over personal safety, a recurring theme in Victoria Cross citations. Thomas Henry Kavanagh, a civilian, volunteered to carry a message through enemy lines during the siege of Lucknow, disguised and traveling at night. Every step was uncertain. The slightest sound might have betrayed me. Yet, the necessity of the task left no alternative. His award highlights that the Victoria Cross is not confined to traditional combat roles, but rests on the nature of the action itself. The early recipients collectively established a pattern defined by immediacy, risk, and impact, creating a standard both specific and adaptable. These elements combined to create a legacy of bravery that continues to be the ultimate benchmark for courage across different contexts. It is also important to consider the process by which these early awards were determined. In many Kazton officers, the requirement for verification was present from the beginning, reflecting a concern for accuracy and fairness. However, the conditions of war meant that not all actions could be documented. This introduced an element of subjectivity, one that has persisted throughout the history of the award. The public presentation of the Victoria Cross in 1857 reinforced its significance. By awarding the medals in a visible ceremony, Queen Victoria emphasized the importance of gallantry. The presence of recipients from different ranks underscored the egalitarian principle, while the simplicity of the medal itself focused attention on the actions rather than the decoration. The early years of the Victoria Cross also saw the establishment of traditions. The inscription for valour, chosen over more elaborate alternatives, encapsulates the award in direct terms. It avoids qualification or embellishment, reflecting the idea that the act itself requires no further explanation. As the award began to be applied to conflicts beyond the Crimean War, the standard established by these early recipients provided a reference point. Whether in colonial campaigns, global wars, or modern operations, the criterion remained consistent. Acts were judged in comparison to those that had come before. This continuity is central to the enduring significance of the Victoria Cross. It is not simply an award. It is part of an ongoing tradition. Each recipient is linked to those who received it earlier. The actions of Lucas and O'Connor are benchmarks against which later acts are measured. The Victoria Cross was not designed to recognize ordinary bravery. It was intended to identify and honor actions that stood apart, even in the context of war. This distinction remains the defining feature of the award. The next stage would see the award applied across the expanding British Empire. Soldiers from diverse backgrounds and nations would perform acts of gallantry under a wide range of conditions, further shaping the meaning of the award. These recipients would demonstrate its applicability beyond its original context, ensuring the Victoria Cross remains the ultimate symbol of valour. As the Victoria Cross moved beyond its origins in the Crimean War, it followed the expansion and military engagements of the British Empire. By the latter half of the 19th century, British forces were operating across vast regions, particularly in the Indian subcontinent. It was here amid the Indian Rebellion of 1857 and subsequent frontier campaigns that the Victoria Cross began to assume a broader imperial character. Soldiers of different nationalities, cultures, and backgrounds would come to be recognized under a single standard of gallantry. Initially, eligibility for the Victoria Cross was limited. Indian soldiers serving under the East India Company and later the British Crown were not immediately included. Instead, a separate award, the Indian Order of Merit, served as the highest recognition available to them. However, as the contributions of Indian soldiers became increasingly evident, pressure mounted to extend full recognition of the Victoria Cross to them. In 1911, eligibility for the Victoria Cross was formally extended to Indian troops. This marked a significant development, aligning the award more closely with its stated principle of recognizing valor irrespective of rank or origin. The inclusion of Indian soldiers and, by extension, Gurkha troops serving within the British Indian Army brought new dimensions to the history of the award. Among the most notable early recipients was Kudodad Khan, the first Indian soldier to be awarded the Victoria Cross during the First World War, serving as a machine gunner with the 129th Baluchis. Khan was deployed to the Western Front in 1914 near Hollebeke, Belgium. The situation rapidly deteriorated under attack. The majority of his detachment was killed or wounded, and Khan himself was injured. Despite this, he continued to operate his machine gun, maintaining fire and preventing a breakthrough by advancing German forces at a critical moment. The official citation records that he remained at his gun, firing until all other members of his detachment were killed or disabled. Khan later said there was no thought of leaving. The gun had to continue. If it had come through. Gurkha soldiers also feature prominently in the award's history. Their reputation for resilience in difficult terrain made them suited to frontier warfare. Among them, Kulber Thapa stands out. During the Battle of Luce in 1915, Thapa displayed conspicuous bravery under fire. After his unit suffered heavy casualties, he repeatedly ventured into exposed areas to rescue wounded soldiers, including a British comrade. A contemporary account describes how, under continuous fire, he moved forward, locating the wounded and bringing them back one by one. Thopa's conduct highlights another dimension: sustained bravery. His actions were not just a single moment, but repeated exposure to danger over hours. Both forms meet the standard, provided they demonstrate exceptional courage and impact, cementing their place in the history of the Victoria Cross. Another recipient, Lahiman Gurung exemplifies. During the Burma campaign in the Second World War, Gurung was manning a forward position when it came under attack by Japanese forces, despite being severely wounded by a grenade that injured his hand. He continued to hold his position, using his remaining hand to operate his rifle. The official citation notes that he refused to leave his post and continued to fire upon the enemy, preventing them from overrunning the position. His actions were not a brief response, but a sustained defense against repeated assaults. First-hand descriptions convey the intensity. The position was under constant attack. Grenades, small arms fire, it did not stop. Yet he remained, firing and holding the line. Gurung's case demonstrates the principle of persistence under conditions where withdrawal might have been justified. The decision to remain and continue fighting despite injury and isolation, reflects the highest level of commitment. The extension of the Victoria Cross across the empire brought recognition to soldiers in colonial campaigns, where conditions differed significantly from European battlefields. These conflicts often involved irregular warfare, difficult terrain, and limited logistical support. Acts of bravery in such environments required courage and adaptability. One such example is Frederick Roberts, who earned the Victoria Cross during the Indian Rebellion of 1857 as a young officer. Roberts engaged in actions that involved both direct combat and leadership under fire. His later career would see him rise to prominence, but it was his early conduct that earned him the award. Accounts describe the fluid nature. The fighting was close and confused, with positions changing rapidly. In such conditions, individual initiative was essential. The diversity of recipients during this period reflects the geographic and cultural breadth of the British Empire. Soldiers from Britain, India, Nepal, and other regions were recognized under a single standard, creating a shared tradition of valor. At the same time, we must acknowledge the broader context. The British Empire was a complex system shaped by dynamics beyond the battlefield. The Victoria Cross, however, operates at the level of individual action. It recognizes conduct in specific moments, irrespective of the larger context. The inclusion of Indian and Gurkha recipients reinforced the principle that the Victoria Cross is awarded for actions, not identity. This principle, established at the award's creation, found fuller expression as eligibility expanded, contributing to the enduring respect for the decoration. It came to represent a universal standard of courage. First-hand accounts emphasized the same elements: immediacy, risk, and impact. Whether on the Western Front, in the jungles of Burma, or on the frontiers of India, the nature of the actions remained consistent. As one historian observed, the Victoria Cross unites disparate experiences under a single measure: the willingness to act decisively in the face of danger. This unifying principle explains how the award could be applied across such a wide range of conflicts. By the early 20th century, the Victoria Cross was firmly established as the highest recognition of gallantry within the British and Imperial forces. The next phase would see the Victoria Cross tested on an unprecedented scale during the First World War. Industrialized warfare and intense combat would produce new forms of bravery and new challenges in recognizing them. The First World War marked a decisive transformation in the nature of warfare and, consequently, in the conditions under which the Victoria Cross was earned. Unlike earlier conflicts, where individual acts of bravery could occur within more fluid environments, the War of 1914 to 1918 was defined by industrial-scale destruction. It was defined by entrenched positions and sustained artillery bombardments. In this environment, opportunities for conspicuous individual action were both more frequent and difficult to distinguish. The Western Front, in particular, present midi fire. Soldiers lived in trenches for weeks or months at a time. They were exposed to shell fire, gas attacks, and constant attritional warfare. Advances, when they occurred, were often measured in yards rather than miles. Casualty rates were unprecedented in modern military history. Within this context, Acts of exceptional bravery did not stand out because danger was rare, but because it was constant. The Victoria Cross during this period became associated with actions that involved not only courage under fire, but often repeated exposure to it. Many citations describe individuals who returned multiple times into active combat zones to rescue wounded comrades. Lead us saw overwhelming attack. One of the most frequently cited examples of gallantry is that of Noel Chavos, one of only 3 individuals in history to be awarded the Victoria Cross twice, serving as a medical officer in the Royal Army Medical Corps. Chavos's role was to provide medical support under fire rather than engage the enemy directly. His actes species the danger. During the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, Chavos worked continuously under artillery and machine gun fire. He worked to rescue and treat wounded soldiers. His citation records that he spent hours moving between shell holes, attending to the injured despite ongoing bombardment. On one occasion, he returned into a heavily shelled area to search for missing men, fully aware of the risks involved. A contemporaneous account describes the scene. He was seen moving among the wounded under continuous shell fire, carrying equipment and assisting men back to cover. He refused to withdraw despite warnings. Chavos was later mortally wounded while continuing to assist others, illustrating a key feature of Victoria Cross actions. His conduct showed sustained exposure to danger in service of others, often beyond the point of personal safety. Another significant recipient was William McNess, an Australian soldier whose actions at the Battle of Mont St. Quentin in 1918 demonstrated individual initiative. As his unit advanced against entrenched German positions, McNess repeatedly engaged enemy positions under heavy fire, enabling the continued movement of his company. Fellow soldiers describe the intensity. The advance was held up by machine guns. He moved forward alone, engaging positions that were pinning the unit down. Without his action, the advance would have stalled. This pattern individual action, enabling collective movement, became a recurring theme in Victoria Cross citations. The scale of operations meant that single acts could have disproportionate tactical effects, particularly when units were immobilized by enemy fire. The war also saw significant contributions from soldiers of the wider British Empire. Indian troops continued to serve with distinction, including recipients such as Gobind Singh Ratha, who displayed extraordinary courage in Mesopotamia. Gurkha units, in particular, continued to reinforce their reputation for resilience in difficult terrain and close combat. One Gurkha recipient, Kulbar Thapa, previously awarded for actions in earlier campaigns, exemplified the continuity of bravery across conflicts. His repeated rescues of wounded soldiers under fire in France reinforced the perception of Gurkha units as consistently reliable under the most extreme conditions. A British officer's account of Gurkha actions during trench assaults records they moved forward with determination, often under fire that would have halted other units. Their discipline under such conditions was remarkable. The nature of trench warfare also meant that many Victoria Cross actions involved defensive rather than offensive bravery. Holding positions under attack, maintaining communication lines, and preventing breakthroughs became as significant as leading charges. One example is Lance Corporal William Angus, who rescued a wounded officer trapped in no man's land. Under continuous fire, Angus made multiple attempts to reach the injured man, eventually succeeding despite sustaining his own injuries. His citation emphasizes persistence. He went out, repeatedly under heavy fire, until he succeeded in bringing the wounded officer back to safety. The First World War also introduced new forms of warfare that affected how bravery was expressed. The use of machine guns, artillery barrages, poison gas, and aerial reconnaissance created environments in which survival itself required extraordinary endurance. In such conditions, the distinction between routine duty and exceptional action became increasingly narrow. Historian Christopher Hibbert noted that the Victoria Cross became not a rarity of courage, but a distinction among acts of courage already abundant. This observation highlights the paradox of the conflict. Bravery was common, but recognition required distinction even within that commonality. The administrative process of awarding the Victoria Cross also became more complex during this period, with large-scale battles involving thousands of soldiers. Verifying individual actions required multiple witness statements and detailed reports. In some cases, recommendations. Nevertheless, the criteria remained consistent. The act must be observed, verified, and judged to represent most conspicuous bravery. The First World War ultimately produced the highest number of Victoria Crosses awarded in any single conflict. This reflects both the intensity of the war and the opportunities for individual acts of exceptional courage. Yet, even within this expanded number, the proportion of recipients remained extremely small relative to the millions who served. This reinforces the central characteristic of the award, its selectivity. Even in a war defined by mass participation and mass casualty, the Victoria Cross remained reserved for actions that stood apart. The legacy of the First World War within the history of the Victoria Cross is therefore twofold. It demonstrated the adaptability of the award to industrial warfare, and it established that exceptional individual action could still be identified and recognized. The Second World War expanded the scale, geography, and technological complexity of conflict beyond anything previously experienced in modern history. It also placed the Victoria Cross into environments far more diverse than the trench systems of the First World War. Battles were now fought across continents Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, Burma, and the Atlantic, and across domains including air, sea, and mobile land warfare. Despite these changes, the core criteria for the Victoria Cross remained unchanged: most conspicuous bravery in the presence of the enemy. However, the ways in which this bravery manifested evolved. Speed, mobility, and mechanized firepower created situations where individual actions had decisive effects. One of the defining theaters of the war was the Burma Campaign, where British, Indian, and Commonwealth forces faced Japanese armies in dense jungle terrain. This environment bore some resemblance to earlier colonial warfare, but with significantly higher intensity. Supply lines were fragile and visibility was extremely limited. Among the most notable recipients in this theater was John Neil Randall. During the Battle of Kohima in 1944, he led repeated counterattacks. Randall led his men against Japanese positions that threatened to overrun key defensive areas. Despite being wounded, he continued to coordinate resistance under fire. A battalion report describes the conditions. The fighting was at extremely close quarters. Positions changed hands repeatedly, often within minutes. Randall's actions reflect a broader theme: leadership under fragmentation. Jungle combat often broke down cohesion, requiring junior officers to assume leadership roles spontaneously. Another significant figure is Lance Naik Albert Ecker, a soldier of the Indian Army who was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, awarded for his actions during the Battle of Gangasaga in 1971. Ecker's legacy is rooted in the Commonwealth tradition established during the Second World War. His actions involved single-handedly attacking enemy positions that were inflicting heavy casualties, continuing despite severe wounds. The evolution of bravery from the World Wars to later conflicts highlights how individual courage remains the ultimate factor in the face of mechanized chaos. The Victoria Cross remains a symbol of that enduring human spirit across the most complex battlefields in history. During the Second World War itself, Gurkha soldiers continued to distinguish themselves under the same traditions established in earlier conflicts. One example is Sher Bahadur Thapa, who was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously for actions in Burma during an enemy attack on his position. He held his ground alone after his section had been killed or wounded. He continued to operate his weapon and delay the enemy advance. A surviving account describes, he remained at his post even when surrounded. The position was overrun only after sustained pressure and heavy casualties. This pattern-isolated defense under overwhelming odds became one of the defining archetypes of Second World War Victoria Cross actions. In the European theatre, the nature of warfare shifted again. Mechanized units, armored warfare, and airborne operations created new tactical environments. One famous recipient was John Cornwell, though World War II produced many others whose actions reflected naval and amphibious warfare under extreme conditions. Amphibious operations, such as those in Normandy in 1940, for created conditions where individuals were exposed immediately upon landing. Under machine gun and artillery fire, soldiers had to traverse open beaches, often under coordinated defensive fire. Acts of bravery in these conditions frequently involved moving forward despite heavy casualties to secure exits from the beaches. One report describes troops advanced across open ground under intense fire. Casualties were heavy, but small groups continued to push forward, enabling the establishment of footholds inland. In the Pacific theater, Australian forces also played a significant role. The jungle warfare of New Guinea presented conditions similar to Burma, but with even greater logistical isolation. One notable figure is Edward Kenner, who earned the Victoria Cross during the Second World War. In 1945, Kenner advanced alone under fire to neutraliser ennemis dangereux. His actions allowed the advance to continue and prevented further casualties. A fellow soldier later recalled, "He just went forward. There was no hesitation. The fire was heavy, but he kept moving until the position was dealt with." The Second World War also saw increased recognition of airborne operations, where soldiers were dropped behind enemy lines with limited support. These operations required rapid adaptation, as units often became scattered upon landing. Individual initiative was therefore critical. A consistent theme across all theaters is the increasing decentralization of action. World War II frequently reduced combat to small groups or individuals operating independently within larger strategic frameworks. Historian John Keegan noted that the Second World War produced a battlefield in which the individual soldier could once again become decisive, not because the war was smaller, but because it was more fragmented. This fragmentation created conditions in which Victoria Cross actions could emerge. Despite the global scale of the war, the Victoria Cross remained extremely rare. Millions served, yet only a small number received the award. This reinforces its defining characteristic. It is not a measure of participation, but of exceptional distinction within participation. The Second World War expanded the geographical scope of the Victoria Cross without altering its core principle. Whether in jungles, deserts, seas, or European battlefields, the award continued to recognize actions that stood apart within environments of extreme danger. The next phase would move into the post-war era, setting the stage for modern interpretations of valor in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The aftermath of the Second World War did not bring an end to large-scale conflict within the British and Commonwealth military tradition. Instead, it marked a transition from global industrial warfare to regional, often irregular conflicts defined by insurgency, political fragmentation, and decolonization. Within this changing landscape, the Victoria Cross continued to be awarded, but increasingly under conditions that differed markedly from earlier conventional battlefields. The Korean War represented the first major post-war test of this new era. Fighting was characterized by rapid offensives and brutal winter conditions. Commonwealth forces, including British and Australian contingents, were engaged in both defensive and offensive operations against North Korean and Chinese forces. One of the most prominent Victoria Cross recipients from this conflict was Bill Speakman. During intense fighting near Kapyong in 1951, Speakman repeatedly carried ammunition and grenades forward under heavy fire to sustain his unit's defense. His actions were conducted in full view of sustained enemy fire, and he was wounded multiple times during the engagement. A battalion report describes the position was under continuous assault. Without the actions of individuals moving ammunition forward, the line would likely have been breached. Speakman's citation reflects a broader trend: sustained bravery under conditions of prolonged engagement rather than isolated acts. Following Korea, the Malayan emergency represented a shift toward counterinsurgency warfare in dense jungle terrain. Unlike conventional warfare, the enemy did not present itself in large formations, operating instead within civilian populations and remote jungle areas. The Victoria Cross was awarded to Lance Corporal Charles Campbell for leading assaults on fortified, insurgent positions under difficult terrain conditions. First-hand accounts note the jungle was concealment for the enemy. Every movement had to be deliberate. Contact was often sudden and at close range. This environment closely foreshadowed later conflicts in Vietnam and Afghanistan, where irregular warfare would again dominate. The Vietnam War marked another evolution. The nature of combat placed heavy emphasis on small unit operations, reconnaissance, and counter-guerrilla warfare. One of the most notable Australian recipients is Rain Stewart Simpson, who displayed extraordinary bravery in defending his unit under intense attack. His actions involved repeatedly exposing himself to fire to rescue wounded comrades and maintain defensive positions. Reports note the position was subjected to sustained attack. Individuals continued to move between positions to evacuate the wounded. Keith Payne was also awarded the Victoria Cross in 1969 for leading efforts to locate and extract wounded soldiers after his unit was ambushed. His actions involved navigating through hostile terrain and coordinating evacuation efforts under extremely dangerous conditions. Payne later recalled, "There was no time to think beyond the next movement. You could only focus on getting to the next man." These accounts reinforce a key theme. The Victoria Cross in the post-war era increasingly recognized rescue under fire and leadership in fragmented engagements. It honored sustained exposure to danger in environments where traditional front lines no longer existed. The transition into modern conflicts, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq, continued this trend but introduced new complexities. Warfare in these environments was defined by asymmetry. Opponents were not uniform armies but dispersed networks of insurgents operating in both rural and urban environments. The absence of fixed battle lines created conditions where combat was unpredictable and often instantaneous. In Afghanistan, Australian forces encountered a highly adaptive insurgency. The terrain mountainous, rural, and difficult to traverse favored small groups capable of rapid movement and concealment. Improvised explosive devices, ambush tactics, and hit-and-run engagements became common features of the conflict. It was in this environment that Mark Donaldson earned the Victoria Cross in 2008 during a patrol under heavy fire. Donaldson exposed himself repeatedly to enemy fire to rescue a wounded interpreter. His actions occurred during an active engagement where the patrol was under sustained attack. The official citation records he deliberately exposed himself to enemy fire on multiple occasions in order to recover a wounded coalition partner and bring him to safety. First-hand accounts from those present describe the intensity of the engagement. It was chaotic. Fire was coming from multiple directions. Isinin Tetmoma Imerili. Ben Robert Smith was awarded the Victoria Cross for actions in Afghanistan in 2010. His citation describes an assault on enemy positions that were inflicting casualties on his patrol. Under heavy fire, he advanced to neutralize enemy machine gun positions, enabling his unit to continue its mission. A patrol member recalled, "The fire was intense. The position had to be dealt with, or we were going to be pinned down completely." He moved forward and resolved it. It is important to note that Robert Smith's later legal and public controversies do not alter the official citation, which reflects a specific act of gallantry under combat conditions. Across these post-war conflicts, a consistent pattern emerges. The Victoria Cross continues to be awarded for actions involving immediate risk, often in isolation and frequently in environments where traditional military structures are fragmented or absent. Whether in jungle warfare, counterinsurgency, or asymmetric modern combat, the underlying standard remains unchanged. Historian Max Hastings summarizes this continuity. The Victoria Cross has adapted to every form of warfare, but its essence has never changed. It recognizes those who act when others might reasonably hesitate. The rarity of the award remains one of its defining features. Across all modern conflicts, despite millions of personnel serving, only a handful of Victoria Crosses have been awarded. This reinforces its position not as a measure of participation, but as a recognition of actions that exceed even the highest expectations. The modern era of the Victoria Cross demonstrates that while warfare continues to evolve, the fundamental nature of extraordinary courage remains consistent. Whether in Korea's frozen hills, Malaya's jungles, Vietnam's rice paddies, or Afghanistan's mountains, the same defining principle applies: decisive action in the presence of overwhelming danger. Across nearly 2 centuries of conflict, the Victoria Cross has remained structurally unchanged in purpose, even as warfare itself has transformed beyond recognition. From the trenches of the First World War to the jungles of Burma, from the frozen ridges of Korea to the mountains of Afghanistan, the award has consistently represented a singular threshold: action under direct enemy presence that is judged to be so exceptional it stands above all other acts of bravery occurring in the same moment of war. What distinguishes the Victoria Cross from almost every other military decoration is not only its prestige, but its extreme scarcity. This scarcity is not accidental, it is foundational. In every major conflict involving Britain and the Commonwealth, from the Napoleonic legacy wars through to modern operations, millions have served and countless acts of courage have occurred. Soldiers, sailors, and airmen have repeatedly faced death, injury, and extreme psychological pressure. Yet only a minute fraction of those acts have been recognized with the Victoria Cross. This creates a structural paradox at the heart of the award. Bravery in war is common, but recognition at this level is exceptionally rare. As military historian Christopher Hibbert observed, the Victoria Cross is awarded not for bravery in general, but for a level of bravery that remains exceptional even within environments already defined by extraordinary courage. The award therefore functions not as a measure of participation in danger, but as a distinction within danger itself. One of the most enduring symbolic elements of the Victoria Cross is its material origin. Tradition holds that each medal is cast from bronze derived from captured cannon, while the precise provenance has been debated. The symbolic meaning has remained consistent. The transformation of instruments of war into a representation of individual courage. This continuity of material symbolism reinforces the continuity of meaning. The decoration has remained visually unchanged since its inception in 1856, deliberately resisting embellishment or redesign. Its simplicity reflects its purpose. It does not commemorate victory, rank, or campaign success. It commemorates an act. As noted in records held by the UK National Archives, the original royal warrant explicitly stated that the award was to be a simple cross of bronze, ensuring that no distinction of social class or military rank would be reflected in its design. In the entire history of the award, only 3 individuals have ever been awarded the Victoria Cross twice. The first is Noel Chevos, a medical officer who served during the First World War. His actions at the Battle of the Somme and later at Passchendaele involved repeated exposure to artillery fire while tending to wounded soldiers in no man's land. His second award came posthumously. During intense fighting in 1917, Chavos again entered a heavily shelled area to search for wounded men. He was mortally wounded during this action. His citation reflects sustained devotion rather than a single act. He repeatedly went out under heavy fire to search for and attend to the wounded, continuing until he was fatally injured. The second double recipient is Arthur Martin Leake. His first Victoria Cross was awarded during the Second Boer War for rescuing wounded soldiers under fire. His second came during the First World War, where he again served as a medical officer and repeatedly exposed himself to danger at the front. Martin Leake's two awards span different wars, reflecting continuity of conduct across decades. The third double recipient is Charles Upham, a New Zealand soldier awarded the Victoria Cross and Bar during the Second World War. Upham served in Crete and North Africa, where his actions included leading assaults and defending positions under heavy fire. He displayed outstanding courage and leadership over a prolonged period under continuous fire, repeatedly exposing himself to danger. Upham's case is significant because he is the only combat arms soldier rather than medical personnel to receive both awards. His reputation is defined by sustained operational effectiveness under extreme conditions, embodying the ultimate threshold of valor. The persistence of the Victoria Cross across time raises a central question. Why has no other military decoration displaced or surpassed it in recognition? The answer lies in its design philosophy. Unlike many awards that recognize cumulative service or leadership, the Victoria Cross is exclusively event-based. It is awarded for a specific act in a specific moment under specific conditions. This creates a threshold that is absolute within context. As military historian John Keegan observed, the Victoria Cross survives because it isolates the moment of decision in war. It is the instant when an individual acts without guarantee of survival or success. This focus on the moment of decision is critical. It distinguishes the award from others that recognize sustained service or command achievement across all conflicts involving Britain and the Commonwealth. The majority of service members never encounter the conditions required for such recognition. Those who do often encounter them briefly and unexpectedly. The award therefore reflects not a career, but a moment. When viewed across history, it reveals a consistent structure of meaning. It is not shaped by the evolution of weapons or tactics. Instead, it is shaped by the constancy of human behavior under extreme conditions, whether in Crimea, the Western Front, or Afghanistan. The same defining elements recur: immediate threat and individual decision under pressure, direct exposure to enemy action, and a willingness to act despite foreseeable risk. These conditions transcend technology and era. The Victoria Cross functions as a historical constant, providing continuity between eras of conflict that are otherwise radically different in scale and character. In the modern era, the award retains its meaning because it is tied not to doctrine, but to human action under irreversible conditions. As one historian Summarized, the Victoria Cross is not a reflection of war, but of what remains constant choosing to act despite certainty of danger. Across history, millions have served in combat. Yet, the number of Victoria Crosses awarded remains extraordinarily small in proportion. This imbalance is not a flaw in the system. It is the system's defining feature. It is not designed to be widely attainable. It is designed to identify the rarest convergence of circumstance and action. It is not a measure of participation, but of exception.